I'd like to welcome today my guest, Connor Kavanaugh. Connor works in the field of special needs trust and planning for individuals. But today we're going to talk about a little something different. The title of this particular series is Bourbon with Generations That Can Legally Drink or Not. And so uh, Connor is actually part of the Y generation, but we're going to call them millennials for today because that's a better term and known term on that. But welcome, Connor.
Gary, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So, to begin with, we're asking the question: what is your personal take on aging? Personal philosophy on aging?
Man, well, um, I would start by saying this. I think when I think about it, in my mind, I separate, I think the aging of the mind versus the aging of the body. And I have a
Oh,
couple of examples I'll I'll give you, but um, the aging of the mind versus the aging of the body, where I've been around enough people that maybe uh maybe in their 70s or their 80s, but I will tell you the way in which they think about life and the responses and the things in which they do and the travel, I would say they're two different people of what you see versus what they do on a daily basis. So obviously it's aging is a part of life, that
hmm.
it's inevitable that people get one day older as each day goes by. um, but uh, but it's something that you know yeah, it doesn't just end at a certain point, but I guess we can dive into more of that. I don't want to start going down different paths, but I'll let you kind of guide the conversation. But
Okay, I think you're absolutely correct on the concept of mind versus body. We both work with older individuals and doing that, and people always are asking me, "What's the client's age?" And I go, "I don't know." Primarily because I have 90-year-olds that you would think would be 60 or 70 because of their mindset and because of the body. And then I have 65 to 70-year-olds that you think were 90. So I think it's very important to make that distinction, and thank you for doing that. What do you think is successful for the folks in aging? What makes the ones successful in how they're aging?
yeah, I'll answer that question by giving a quick example. So I had a football coach in college. He was in his early 80s. And he had spent his entire career coaching high school, college, and professional athletes, all between, call it 14 years old on the
Mhm.
young end of high school up to probably 40 in the professional leagues. And so his entire career he was hanging out with young people. And when I played for him, he was in his early 80s, but
Mhm.
yet he may be 80, on the scorecard, for lack of a better analogy, of, that was his age, but because he'd hung out with young people for his entire career, he just thought differently. He was far more active. He would use the terms that young people used because it was just kind of his surroundings, and it probably is just attributed to, you're a product of your surroundings.
Mhm.
And so I always use that as an example of, as um, just being conscious about what you're taking in, because obviously that's what's gonna, uh, what you're gonna put out in the end. So
Absolutely. And I think if individuals we tend to focus just on the group within our generations. We don't do the cross generational type of interactions that a lot of people do. And surely other countries and cultures do, especially when the older individuals living with the children and grandparents and parents, they tend to have a little more sense of that. In the US, we don't.
mm,
What do you think the general philosophy, not philosophy, but take of your generation is of the baby boomers, for example? What would you think the baby boomers' take on aging is?
gosh, so I think the baby boomers obviously grew up in a different time, a time, post-war, where life was significantly different, and I think not just different from what we use on a daily basis, but also just the philosophy, the mindset, post-war. Um, I think as I think about baby boomers in my life, I would say you know, um, baby boomers in my life. Let me think about this. So. like my dad, for example, he's a baby boomer. He worked for the same company his entire career.
Right.
He same company for the last, 30 years. Well, I can tell you, I won't have any friends that'll work for the same company for 30 years.
Right.
And so you take that generation where they're very, um, uh, the company in which they work for defines them. Where I think, our generation, gosh, it feels like it's different. Where the company's not going to tell you what to do. You have your own way of doing it. We're a contrarian generation. It feels like we kind of are going against the grain,
Hmm.
so, um, yeah, very, very different. And my grandpa, for example, he taught at the same university his entire career,
Yeah.
lived in the same city, taught the same university his entire career. And now I have friends that are in teaching profession. The more I think about it, and they're moving. One just moved to San Diego to take a job,
Yeah. Yeah.
just because. So,
Well, I think when I and I always preface this by say I Uber a lot, and so when the Uber drivers are there, I tend to ask the question, "What generation are you, and what's your opinion of these generations?" And when I ask the millennials and the X generation what they think of baby boomers, I I get the same response from most of them, which is they tend to be very conservative and very closed in their thinking process and stuck in a rut. And I think that's exactly what you're describing is this generation and I'm part of the boomer, I'm right on the cusp. Part of the boomer generation is such that we find comfort in routine. And so I think that's what you see. And so I think that's kind of defined that generation. Your generation, though, I think is probably going to be defined by technology and the ability to be flexible and moving around. So, what's your thought on your generation on technology and how you've adapted to that and how you're utilizing that versus the boomers?
you know, I remember, and I'm sorry, Gary, I'm using a bunch of stories, but I remember coming home. Um, for Christmas break, and this was, gosh, probably 15 years ago. And my brother I think he was a sophomore at Oregon State, and he was setting up his Facebook account for the first time. This
Hmm.
is the first time I heard about it. He was setting up his Facebook account. At that point in time, Facebook, if you were going to open a profile, you had to have a .edu email address.
Hmm.
And so, um, that was the first time where Facebook had really just launched the previous couple of years to now Facebook is one of the largest publicly
Right.
traded companies out there. And so I use that as an example of saying, you know, uh, our generation has really seen life before some of these big technologies that we use on a daily
Hmm.
basis. Um, so we saw it before, we saw it during the growth, and we obviously live it on a daily basis now. So, um, I think um, seeing kind of the before and after and living through some of those big changes, ultimately will define our generation. Um, you know, um, we have 30-year-old millionaires who are millennials who don't work, never worked, but they decided to launch a cryptocurrency, or they decided that they're going to start as a gamer in college, and they make six figures and all they do is just game all day. And so I think that defines us as um, just we don't go with the status quo. I think our
Right.
life has changed because of technology. To your point, that has allowed us to do many different things that previous generations have not had the ability to do, which leads us, I think, to think outside the box and to say, um, let's move to San Diego just because there's a flight down there and we can, and I got a friend that lives down there and they're letting me sleep on their couch.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the interesting thing is about generations is that some of the uh, primary X and boomers, and to be honest with you, some of the what we call the silent generation, which is before 1901 to, I mean, 1925 to 1945 group, which my mom falls into that. She just turned 92. She uses a flip phone, cell phone. She has got that thing down like you wouldn't believe. and calling all over the place. So I think each generation is kind of taking on what they utilize in the technology world, but some have not. And I think that's important to recognize is that some generations will pick it up, others will not. But uh, I the boomer generation is one I call the transitional generation because we went from non-technology to bringing technology to place, and then the generation X brought it even further, and the millennials have got it to where it is today. And I think that's a huge step to take within one's lifetime. But one of the things that when we talk to Generation Z is that social media is tending to dominate um, their lives. Do you think that's an issue for your generation?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. The amount of time that's spent on these technology platforms, I don't think most people realize. I think it's a habit for many, me included, that the first thing you do when you get up in the morning is you want to get connected to the world, and that's through Instagram, that's through Twitter, that's through Facebook. Frankly, that's where I get a ton of updates on what's happening in the world.
Right.
And so you're so connected to those, and you're so reliant on those that, to a certain extent, it takes over your life, and then you can't kind of pull away from it because it is your information source. It's the way you stay connected to high school friends and college friends, and hear about your cousin just had a baby. So it's I'm not sure it's a healthy thing. There's obviously tons of webinars and podcasts and articles about the impact of social media, and those technologies in our lives. But um, it's definitely integrated into the daily routines of all millennials.
Right. And I think that that's a struggle that your generation and especially Generation Z is going to have is how much impact do you allow social media to have on your personal life? And in talking to those individuals in Generational Z, they're realizing that there are some benefits to social media, but there's also some challenges to social media um, on just having it control their entire lives, but also uh, people can post anything and everything on there, and so they're getting a little more concerned about the negative aspects of people, uh, basing their entire self worth on the internet system. And I thought that we just interviewed True Ware, who's one of the Generation Z, and that's one of the things that she was talking about is that we can't let this define us. We've got to be able to realize our self worth without social media, and I think that's very important for every generation to understand that. What do you think, Connor, is the boomers' philosophy on aging? What do you think they think aging is? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mhm. 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 Right. Well, well, I think your comment will go back earlier about mind body, and I'm going to call it a connection because that really is what the aging process is for the boomer generation. But when I look at the boomer generation, and especially when we talk about the silent generation, our parents from the boomer generation, um, I'm surprised that more advocacy hasn't been done by that generation on aging, particularly around the Alzheimer dementia diagnoses, the health diagnoses. They've made great stride, but that area, which is devastating to that population, has not done that. And so I'm very surprised that more people aren't out doing advocacy in that arena uh, through that process. Also, I'm surprised that the that group has turned more conservative than what they were. I was in junior high in the '60s. Back in those days, uh, those are the groups that were out there protesting the Vietnam War, making great inroads into social justice. But we've kind of turned conservative at this point. But I can tell you, they were the first. Boomers were the first ones lined up at the marijuana shops in Washington when they first opened because they were all lined up to get the pot because that's what they did their generation. So I think aging is that type of thing of what I'm seeing. So um, that's a broad stroke across it. But so do you think the aging on the boomer side uh, is going to lead to changes within that community, or do you think it's too late for us to make those changes?
No, I think um, I think it's not too late. I mean, I would say because it's such a personal experience, I think there's gonna be changes made because now they're at the forefront of facing those points and times in their lives, not only for their own lives but for a family member, whether it's a sibling or it's a parent or somebody like that. Because I think a lot of changes is driven off of personal experience.
Sure.
People make changes because they go through something in their own personal life and they say, I need to come up with a new mousetrap, a new way to do this. And so um yeah.
So, as a millennial with a baby boomer parents, have you given any thought on how you're going to handle their aging process?
Honestly, I have not. I have not. But I'm now getting to the point that you see grandparents age
Uh huh.
and get to the point in which they age very quickly, and you see how my parents have handled that. I had a grandparent, grandfather passed away in June of 2020, and my mom is an only child, and with my grandma there, it was really just on them two to really handle everything,
Mm-hmm.
and so I see that as kind of one step behind as my mom's son, and I think that was a good learning experience where you say we we have to figure out a way in which we can continue to improve the experience, do a better job of kind of planning forward, have the necessary documents in place, and all those types of things. It's I've come to realize there's more involved in it than one would initially think who doesn't deal with it on a daily basis, and you see it
Absolutely.
on the business side as well as I do. But
Do you think that the parents, your mother, and I know I've had to have discussions about this, and it's been very difficult about end of life decisions because what happens, if they have a stroke and all that sort of thing, to do that. And those are difficult discussions. Uh, but do you think those discussions, your generation would be able to have them with their baby boomer parents?
I would say, and this is just me just putting a couple seconds of thought to it, I think for the most part, our generation would feel comfortable having those conversations. I would guess and say that the baby boomer generation, I think there's a lot of them that probably don't believe they're out there at that point in time in which that conversation
Mhm.
needs to start to happen. And I
Sure.
totally get it. To realize that you're getting to an age that you have to start doing some of this end of life planning is a realization that the end may be nearer than you thought.
Right.
And so to yeah, directly answer your question, I would 100% feel comfortable along with many other millennials I know. I think it's again the generation, above them, the baby boomers, their parents, that probably say, "No, no, no, we're not having this conversation yet. We're not talking
That's
about
true.
end of life and money, and I'm not sharing all this information with you."
Yeah, yeah. You're absolutely correct on that one. I know from my experience in talking with older folks, they're going, and they. My mother was 90 when I finally set her down and said, we have to talk about whether do not resuscitate orders or not. Oh no, I don't need to do it. But you're 90, so at some point we've got to have this discussion. And we finally did, but it was difficult for her, even at 90, to recognize that and do it. But and also, she handled things a little differently. It was easier for her to move into an assisted living than I've known other people to do and other relatives. But I think those housing options have to be discussed as well in doing that. So, um, what contributions do you think your generation is going to make or has made already?
You know, uh, I would say, Gary, we're the ones that are pulling up the linoleum that's on those really nice oak floors. I
No
can't remember
shag
where I heard
carpet.
this.
No
Yeah,
shag
yeah.
carpet. Yeah.
Where I can't remember where I heard this or read this, but it was our generation is the one that is pulling up the linoleum in the kitchen, exposing these very beautiful oak wood floors from 1919 that have never been walked on before. Um, but aside from that, you know, um, I would say, well, your question was um, about what can we do better in the future. Give me
No,
that
it
question
was
again, Gary. Sorry.
what
Gotcha.
contributions has your generation made or will make in the future?
Yeah. So I think um, I think on the technology side, the development and the implementation of the Facebooks and the Twitters,
Mhm.
we developed a lot of these technologies. We were the ones to, see it roll out kind of in firsthand. I hate going to this as well, but the it seems like crypto is continuing to like change the world, and
Right.
um, you know, uh, uh, I guess we'll chalk it up as a win for the millennials. Um, I think we're one of the generations that is um, again going against the status quo, and I think we've
Mhm.
seen that in the last real last couple of years. That we're starting to be more, I guess, yeah, against the grain. The ones that work for 10 employers in the last 10 years, that don't work for the same companies for the 28 years.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thinking about things a bit differently. Um, that you don't work for the company, you work with the company. You know,
Okay.
um, people that work. What's an example? Um, Yeah, I guess it was going back to, I think he's my grandfather, for example. He worked for the same, university his entire teaching career, and that was like a part of the family. Well, I think our
Right.
generation doesn't see their employer as a part of their family. It's they're working, with them as opposed to, for them. So it's this
Right.
independent thinking, I guess. So whether that's a contribution, I'm not really sure.
Well, I think it's a contribution, and I would label your generation the rebel generation, actually, because you're really going in and relooking at what has been the standard of things the entire time and kind of reevaluating and doing that one. Um, The thing about the rebel generation, your generation, millennials, is I'm curious about how you view the work life balance and how that, because you work with a company, but again, the work life balance, how does your generation kind of see that aspect?
You know, gosh, I think I would say generally for the most part, I think we're seeing a lot more work-life balance among our generation. Though, I have friends who say the complete opposite, where they work 7 days a week, they work 10 hours a day, they absolutely love it. But for the most part, um, I think they enjoy the remote working. They don't mind answering an email on a Sunday, but they'll leave the office early on a Friday.
Hmm.
So I think it's more work life balance than previous generations. Um, I think there's probably more things to do. I think transportation is much easier in our generation, where to jump on a plane in the '60s was a little bit more
Right.
difficult than jump on a
Right.
plane now. Um, I think the ability for you to jump on your smartphone and find out exactly where your friends are at,
Yeah.
or open up your Instagram profile and you can see, what the latest picture was at the local pub. I think drives people to more activities, do more, be more connected, which ultimately I think leads them to say, I'm not defined by my work, but I want to have more balance and spend more time with friends or family outside of just your typical 9 to 5. So
And I think that's a good point. I think the baby boomers, and I'm not real sure about the Gen X people, but the baby boomers, I think, are defined by their work. I know when people retire, friends I retire from work and worked a long time within an industry or something, have a very difficult time in redefining themselves. I don't think your generation is going to have that. I think you are a little more well rounded, probably, than our generation is. Uh, the other thing is, do you think your generation is going to be advocating for different things like extended parental leave, those type of things, or do you think they're going to again stay within the status quo? Are they going to be independent, or how are they going to adjust for these additional things that other countries have in place that we do not?
yeah, I would say our generation's going to advocate big time for extended leave. I know there's been discussion about uh, the father.
Mm,
A wife is working, she gets her leave once the baby's born. Now there's the ability for the father to have paid time off, which I'm sure 10 and 20 years ago was never a discussion. So
right.
I think we continue to push the status quo on things like that. I also think, and using that example, our generation, goes against the grain on things like, it's the wife that stays home,
Right.
that she's the stay-at-home parent, and the husband goes to work. I think you have a lot of situations where it's the complete opposite.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think to your point of we're the rebel generation. We're thinking differently on things like that, which means that there's changing legislation to keep up with some of those things.
One of the challenges I see is the corporate leaders, and this is true of politicians. They tend to be 80 years old in those roles, or much older, and I see it being very different um, in trying to bring those individuals around to uh, a work life balance, which I think is very important. I certainly do that. But I think that's going to be a challenge, getting those individuals replaced with younger individuals. So hopefully that'll happen at some point. At some point.
The
So
other thing, Gary, sorry to interrupt. I'll
no,
just this just popped into my head, but I think the baby boomer generation, when they end work, more retirement parties because of their association to their employer. I don't see our generation as we get to that age in 30 years having retirement parties, because I think there's a lot of people in our generation that um, not because they don't want a retirement party, but I think the ability to continue to work into your late 60s and 70s because of some of the technologies, or
Mhm.
the fact that our generation may be in a job in which they love so much because they found their vocation that they're going to do it till they're 80 years old and they never really fully retire,
Yeah.
so
I I'm not a big fan of retirement parties myself, so thank you. To do that one, I think probably what I will say that as you age, and it's probably something true for the the baby boomers is if you enjoy what you're doing, it dawns on you one day you're going, "Oh my god, I'm this old and now I need to think about retiring or leaving things done." Um, I hope they will go into areas that they enjoy doing, which is what I've been wanting to do with this podcast. So that's part of my transition the from the role that I currently have. But I really am in awe of the rebel generation for really wanting to be themselves and set their own schedules and do all of that. That's totally amazing. It would have never crossed my mind in my working career to have done that until now. So that's great. I think that is a great way to do the work life balance. Um, what do you think the baby boomers or the Gen X people can do better for future generations like yours?
you know I am a big fan of everything in moderation.
Uh huh.
So I would say what the baby boomers can do well for us is pass the experiences that the baby boomers had, the experiences, the philosophies, the mindset onto the millennial, my generation, so we can be a bit more moderate maybe in some of our ideas or philosophies where
Sure.
um, again it goes back to experiences determine decisions and determines one's outlook, and I think that's such an important part, um, and the reason why there's great mentors that change the lives of young people
Hmm.
is because they can share those experiences with them. So I think the one action item, or the big benefit as we look at some of these different generations is to pass knowledge on, and hopefully it's well received by generations like us.
Hmm. Do you think one of the benefits would be for the boomer generation to realize that what we experienced, and I'm talking about college. When I went to college, it was very minimal. You could pay for tuition, room and board, and everything on a part time job. And I think what we've lost is the focus of that experience has launched many baby boomers in trade schools and all of that. But the cost of education, we aren't funding as well as we our parents did, for example. Uh, and my mom's generation, back in the silent generation, was taxed much more heavily than we are today, but they got better benefits, I think, for the buck for their dollar. And so I hope that one of the things that we can do is realize that this $200,000 in debt to obtain an education is not sustainable. And we need to realize that we need to fund some of these things a little bit more um, to do that. So hopefully that's one of the things that we will be able to rectify, and your generation and future generation will realize the really the benefit of those things um, in that direction. What do you think your generation can do better?
I would say, Gary, I think listening, as
Mhm.
simply as listening, um, where again we're the rebel generation, like you mentioned. You said it much more eloquently, or maybe powerful is the right term, than I did. But because of that, and because of my comment about everything in moderation, is the ability to listen, not only on yeah, to listen about past experiences, to listen about how things should be handled, and then take that information into account in the millennial mindset of going against the status quo, going against the grain.
Right.
um, I think other cultures do a really good job of it. I think other generations, maybe your generation to your parents' generation, did a good job of that. I get a little bit nervous sometimes that our generation is so close-minded to other ideas,
Hmm.
that they have their own ideas. They're very um, independent thinkers. That probably goes along with the rebel, comment you made. But
Right.
can we listen and can we learn? We're obviously going to have our own experiences, whether they're right or wrong. But uh, do we have enough? Do we have enough maturity to listen and learn from other experiences of other generations?
Right. I guess the other question I'm going to start asking is, do you have friends in the boomer generation? You do? Okay. Because what I'm finding is, and when I talk to younger generations, they tend not to do the intergenerational thing unless they're related. And I think that's very important that if you can have a friend in those generations, that you were able to come together, discuss items, and gain that knowledge. But a lot of people fit in their own generation. And I think that's going to be kind of important to realize on that one. But one of the contributions I think that probably your generation can make is to really push the envelope a little on ideas, um, and to really take whatever you're working on to the next level. I think you're the generation that has to do that. Because the Gen X is getting close to being like the baby boomers. They're starting to start retiring here soon. Um, and I think that that's going to be the big issue for you guys to look at and overcome. Um, what is some common areas do you think that the generations can have together?
Um, I think I think to your point about friendship among different generations, I think experiencing things. Let me make sure I say this in a way that makes sense. But experiencing things together as different generations, because the
Hmm.
interpretation of that experience is going to be different. To your question to me about whether I have friends in different generations. I do, and I think it's good to have friends in different generations that aren't just family members,
Right,
because you can share things with those people in different generations that you may not share with a parent or a family member, which I think is important and healthy. And they're going to share things with you that they probably wouldn't share to a family member. um,
right,
so um, I think it's um, experiencing things together as generations, being able to interpret those differently, and then have conversations together. um, This has happened multiple times, Gary. Your questions are so good. As I think about it, then I lose my train of thought on the question that you asked. But hopefully that that helped.
it did help as great on that one. I think one of the uh, comments I got from the Generation Z folks was they're seeing a perception of ageism a little bit, which because of the Black Lives Matter movement and everything else, they're saying that that is one of the areas that their generation needs to do a little better, is overcoming ageism. Um, and we work with the older populations. Do you think that is something that is out there? Is this ageism concept of discrimination or anything like that, Connor?
Yeah, I would absolutely. I think the last couple years you've seen that move to the forefront. So I think we see that on a day in day out basis. I think um, it's more notable now just because of the rise of social media and the ability to share thoughts and ideas and pictures and experiences so quickly. I
Right,
mean, it could take me 5 seconds to post, an update of what I'm doing right at this moment, and then I could
right.
share that with thousands of people. So, absolutely.
Well, good. I the thousand of people is just mind-boggling to me because I certainly don't have that type of following at all. But I just think that you're absolutely right on everything is so instant anymore that people can do that and start a cause. One of the things that I had a discussion with on the Z was uh, how people post things on social media for causes, but going from that to actual implementation um, might be an issue. And the Z's are saying, well, no, we're going to do that. We've done that. Do you think the millennials will do that as well?
That's a great point. I'm a very action oriented person.
Uh-huh.
I am, uh, 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 I serve on a couple boards. I'm probably the quietest person on the board, but I try to be the most action oriented because I think, especially you jump on social media now, you're going to have hundreds of people that have their own ideas on how things should actually happen. Well, I would say not everyone takes the appropriate amount of action that aligns with, what they want to see happen.
Hmm.
So um, I think everybody can do a better job of taking action because that's by far the most difficult part. The easy part is sharing your thoughts, through some type of social media channel or any other type of channel. The hard
Hmm.
part is waking up the next day and saying, I'm either going to change my actions or my thoughts, or
Hmm.
I'm gonna go down to the state capitol and I'm gonna talk to a legislator about A, B, C, and D.
Right.
So you know, I think that's what will ultimately define our generation. Probably going back to a previous question you asked, but I think in the end, with us being such rebels, is we have a lot of thoughts. I think we've made those thoughts very very clear.
Hmm.
Can we take the necessary action to actually change the world, policy, your local school, your community, whatever?
Right. One of the other things that I think has been interesting is because I asked about the commonality among the generations, is and I'm really looking forward to the interview I did with True Ware, who is the Gen Z, gave me some very good insights onto how we need to find the positive aspects of the generations, which create the common areas, instead of defining them with negativities. And I think that that is where we need to go. I think there's a lot more common among the generations than we realize, but we tend to put things in those, well, for well, we put them into these categories, and then we just aren't open enough, I don't think, to listen. I think you're right on the listening aspect of things, Connor. I really think that people don't do that. Um, and I don't think my generation is as open to new ideas as we were previously, uh, which is kind of interesting, but how we've moved in that direction. But how do you think that your generation is going to uh, look at other countries' programs, and are they going to be willing to incorporate ideas that might be working better in those countries into the US, or do you think they're going to be hesitant to do that?
I sure hope so. I think it's. I mentioned a couple things that probably does a good job of answering that question, but the listening aspect, the
Hmm.
everything in moderation, where we don't have all the answers, and that people from other generations, but also different cultures,
Hmm.
uh, have different experiences in which we may not be having that experience, and so the ability to use that experience to then change things in our own world or community or wherever, I think is a really important aspect. um, Again, I think the big question is, do we have the ability to actually sit down and listen enough to people that we may think are different, or in an area or a country or wherever that we don't see as the same, I guess.
And I think you're correct on that one. It is that I've working in the field that I do. I see a lot of different programs in Europe on mental health and substance abuse that I think would be very good over here. They have high success rates. We just haven't implemented them. So hopefully your generation will be open to that and say, look, this country's doing it better. We can replicate that model and bring it to the US and as a trial, and hopefully we'll have the same success rate as they do. But I think that's very important that we kind of open up the prospect of how to deal with some of the really difficult challenges that each generation has. The baby boomers are dealing with substance abuse in children. Grandparents are raising grandchildren because of these issues. So hopefully we'll come to some common ground on that eventually. But any other thoughts on aging before we?
No, I think, honestly, Gary, I've never thought about these questions until you had me on. So I will tell you, it's allowed me to think about things I've actually never really sat down and thought about. And so I think you stirring up conversations for your listeners and for your guests and for everybody else, I think is important because it's something that I think life moves so quickly, so many times that you don't have a chance to actually sit down and think about things like this that are really
Yeah.
important. So thanks for putting it
Well,
on the forefront.
oh, you're welcome, Connor. But I want to thank you for being one of my first guests. And I really enjoy having these conversations with individuals that are pretty in depth in nature. And so hopefully the podcast will continue to do that. And we're going to look forward to having you talk to us about special needs trust and able accounts and all those wonderful things that you do extremely well. So thank you again, Connor. And we'll stay on for a couple minutes.
Gary, thanks so much.
You're
Absolutely.
welcome.